Well, thank you so much, Chris, for that kind introduction, and thanks to you and Jonah for organizing this amazing conference. It was just that last panel was extraordinary. I mean, wow, so many deep and rich philosophical issues about truth and knowledge. There, I wasn't totally sure what I would talk about. You know, John Horgan, who invited me, said, "Oh, just talk about anything. It'll be all right." But this whole idea of narrative is interesting. I've been thinking about that. But yeah, the approach I'm coming from, I'm a philosopher who thinks about the mind and language and reality and technology. Lately, the last 10 years or so, I've been focusing a lot on technology, both AI and extended realities, virtual and augmented realities. This is all done in the spirit or framework of what I call technophilosophy, which is roughly a kind of a two-way interaction between philosophy and technology, using philosophy to illuminate difficult issues about technology, the status of AI, VR, and so on, but also using technology to shed light on philosophy. I find that thinking about technology can actually help you with some of the the timeless issues of philosophy. Thinking about VR can help you with reality. Thinking about AI can help you think about the mind. So I think it's a two-way interaction. Some of the techno-philosophy I've been interested in has been about, especially about virtual, augmented, extended realities. This book that came out, I guess it's about 3 years ago now, was Reality Plus, all about virtual worlds and the problems of philosophy. How about thinking about virtual realities can inform our thinking about reality in general. I mean, VR technology is a technology for basically creating digital or artificial worlds. So from a techno-philosophy perspective, you can philosophically study these artificial worlds and the technology in its own right. You can also use artificial worlds to shed light on reality in general. And that's some of what I did in that book. But I talked about this theme actually to, I think, one of John's classes here at Stevens a couple of years ago. So I thought I wouldn't recapitulate that here. By the way, this is actually my first time here at Stevens physically. I'm so pleased because every night I look out my window and there's this big red Stevens sign. I mean, it's kind of the other side of the Hudson River. It kind of dominates the skyline along with the W of the W Hotel. So yeah, such a pleasure to actually be here in person after that great interaction we had in John's class a couple of years ago. But yeah, so I thought this time lately I've been thinking more about AI. I mean, it's just, of course, AI is now taking over everything, and any given subject, suddenly thinking about AI in that context has become very salient. I actually did my PhD in an AI lab many years ago at Indiana, working with Doug Hofstadter, who published books like Gödel, Bach. So it's quite deep in my bones. And suddenly, the last few years, all these issues about AI have really just bloomed, come into not just been renewed, but have exploded. So as a philosopher of the mind, I think especially about the mind, and AI technology, I guess, is especially relevant there because it's precisely a technology for potentially building artificial minds. As a philosopher, I want to philosophically study artificial minds, but also use artificial minds to shed light on minds in general. That's the techno-philosophy approach. So today, I guess I want to do a little techno-philosophy on just a few aspects of thinking about AI. Here in particular, I think I'm going to think about the self and persons and identity, and thinking about selves in the age of AI, looking at some of the issues that come up and thinking about the possibility of artificial selves and what all this might tell us about the self in in general. Some of these topics already came up in the last panel. It was fascinating to see the work on artificial embodiments of selves there. I mean, could a large language model or even GPT-me have a self? What light does AI shed on the self in general? Those are my general themes. I was thinking about how to connect this to narratives, storytelling. It's not really exactly what I focus on, but the way to do it came to me just a week or two ago. A way to do it just came to me a week or two ago. I was invited to give a talk at a memorial for the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who many of you may know his work. He's one of the great philosophers of mind of the last 50-odd years. And he contributed a lot to thinking about the self and consciousness. But he also had some ideas about narratives. So I thought maybe I can try and bring together Dennett and narratives just a little, and thinking about AI, partly through this idea, which is Dennett's idea, that the self is what he calls a center of narrative gravity. And I'll just say a little more to explain that in a second. By the way, here's a photo of Dennett that I really like. I took this photo at a conference we organized at NYU, maybe 7-odd years ago. Now it was a conference on animal consciousness. John was there. Anyone see spot John in the audience? Maybe he was sitting over just over the other side. But yeah, there's Dan. And I love it because there's this little halo of light coming down on him, and there he is at the center of his very own narrative gravity. And this is like all of us stand in this relationship to ourselves. Yeah, there's a world out there, but here's us, the self, at the center of the narrative. So Dennett's idea was, the self is the center of, all of us have narratives that we tell about ourselves and about the world, and the self is somehow the center of that narrative, the focal point of our first-person narratives. Here's Dennett's own first-person narrative in a wonderful memoir called I've Been Thinking. So I thought maybe that's a useful device in thinking about AI and language models. But one way to kind of get some of these issues here off the ground, some of the issues about the brain, the self, and the identity I'll be thinking about is this excellent video. There's a film or a documentary that came out in it was early to mid 1980s by a Dutch filmmaker, I think Piet Honderdas, called Victim of the Brain, that explored Hofstadter's and Dennett's ideas. And this is a little clip of Dennett playing himself in a piece based on his short story / article, Where Am I?, which is basically a piece where he ends up having two brains. There are two brains which are kind of hooked up. There's a brain and there's a backup brain, which are potentially controlling his body, and they are kept totally in sync with each other. So he's got a little switch on his belt, which he can use to switch back and forth. And so far, everything's been totally fine. The two brains have been in sync. Whenever you switch, nothing happens. And then, okay, here's a key moment. See if it.
You see, after such a switch, even though I could see and hear and feel and sense whatever was going on in my body, I wouldn't be able to control it. But in any case, every time I've tried it so far, nothing's happened. Here, I'll show you. Thank God. I thought you'd never turn that key. You can't imagine how terrible it's been these last few weeks. But now you know. It's your turn in purgatory. How I've longed for this moment. Oh, I'm sorry. I had to explain it to my brother, I guess you could say. He just gave you all the facts, so I guess you'll understand. About 2 weeks ago, the two brains drifted just a little bit out of sync. Now, I don't know whether my brain is Hubert or York any more than you do.
Anyway, okay, you get the idea. It's
Well, the
a
two brains drifted apart.
wonderful
And
piece.
once
I
the
think
process
Dan
started, it
actually
snowballed.
gave this originally as a talk at the, I think it was the North Carolina colloquium around in the mid 1970s, and he acted the whole thing out, and then it was filmed. It was actually, for me, this was one of the first philosophy articles I ever read, because it was in the book The Mind's Eye, edited by Hofstadter, who later became my advisor, and Dennett. And if anyone's come across this book, it's a wonderful collection of philosophical fables and stories and arguments, all perfectly tuned for a 15-year-old boy that I was at the time. It was one of the things that brought me into philosophy. And although Dan Dennett and I have ended up disagreeing on a few things, if those of you who know about the field know, we've got plenty of disagreements about the topic of consciousness. Nonetheless, he's always a big inspiration to me. And this area of questions about the self, I think, is a place where maybe we have more potential agreements. Let me bring this back. Okay. So where am I raises many questions about the nature of the self and where it can be found. Where in this time when Dennett is being controlled by these two brains in sync, where am I? Where is he? Is he in brain one? Is he in brain two? Is he in both of them? Is he in neither? What am I? It raises more am I fundamentally like a brain? Am I a body? Am I some computation which is shared, jointly implemented in these two brains? And this idea of a center of narrative gravity, at least this actually came later, maybe 10 years or so later, but this connects very naturally to this scenario. Selves, the centers of narrative gravity, the center of the narratives we spin in where am I? Before the split, there's a single narrative with one center of gravity, even when you switch back and forth. Single narrative, one center, one self. After the split, suddenly, there's a whole new narrative. Once he switches that switch, and there's this new narrative. Oh my God, the last 2 weeks I've been stuck in here and nothing's been right, everything's been out of sync, can't communicate with the world. Whole new narrative, whole new center of gravity. And when you switch back and forth, two totally different centers of narrative gravity. After the split, two narratives, two centers. So this kind of beautifully illustrates this idea of the self as a center of narrative gravity. There are some things about this view that I'm not sure I completely agree with. I think, for example, you at least want to take the focus off just our first-person narratives that we tell about ourselves. Some of us tell narratives that get ourselves very deeply wrong. That's not totally uncommon. Say Joe believes he's a moral saint, and in his narrative, he's constantly helping people and doing wonderful things. In fact, he's mostly pretty selfish and looks out for himself. We know people like this. Then the center of his narrative that he's telling about himself and the world is a moral saint. That's his narrative. He's always doing wonderful things. But Joe himself is actually selfish, not a moral saint. So I think identifying his self with the moral saint just in some ways seems wrong. Maybe that's his self-conception, but Joe himself is actually selfish. So if I was to put together this view, I guess maybe I'd put it as something like selves, the centers of interpretive gravity, the centers of the narrative, not just the first-person narratives that you tell about yourself, but about the narratives that other people tell about you and about the narratives that other people can tell about you based on your behavior. Selves are entities that interpreters ascribe beliefs and desires and mental states to in an interpreter's narrative that makes sense of a person, makes sense of your behavior. Third-person narratives, your first-person narratives matter here, but so do the third-person narratives, the narratives that other people tell about you. And I think of all these narratives as coming together. The center of what makes sense of you is like the center of a narrative that makes sense of you for others and for yourself. My colleague Jeff Sebo talks about centers of psychological gravity. I think that's a nice term here. And yeah, Dennett himself wrote a wonderful book called The Intentional Stance, all about how interpreting someone from the third person point of view can give a rich grounding of their psychological lives. We actually have some fairly just deep disagreements about whether interpretation alone can explain things like consciousness. My own view is it can't, but I do think it has a very rich role to play. This now, I think, we can further illustrate this idea with appeal to another popular culture icon, namely the TV series Severance. Who's seen Severance? Okay, who hasn't seen Severance? Okay, this crowd is, okay, it's a Severance crowd. Very good. So yeah, TV. Many of you will at least know the basic idea. Okay, there are these four main characters who find themselves inside this office. These offices with no windows to the outside world, and over time, it turns out that there's two of each of them in a certain sense. There's the innie who spends all their time in the office and who inhabits this body from 9 through 5, and then there's the outie who controls the body from roughly from 5 till 9 the next morning, who's associated mainly with the home life. And these beings are totally disconnected from each other, at least in the sense of memories and plans and so on. The innie has no idea what's going on with the outie. They share a body, but in some sense there seems to be two people there. So in Where Am I, we had this one self across two bodies. In Severance, we have something like two selves sharing a single brain. It's like, at a certain point they go into the elevator and switch from the innie to the outie, and suddenly a whole new person is controlling the body and inhabiting here the brain. The neuroscience of this is not entirely clear. There is some neurosurgery at various points. At one point I thought maybe this was a hemisphere thing, and switching from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, the innie and the outie get one each. Unfortunately, for those of you who've seen the second season, that seems to be ruled out by, we discover there are at least some characters who have more than two personas, maybe even up to 20, which is harder to reconcile with cerebral hemispheres. Maybe, who knows, maybe there's a neuroscience story to be told. But Severance is wonderful philosophically. It raises so many questions. There are just rich questions, already connections to our own work and home life, philosophical reflection on work-life balance, but also philosophical reflection on questions of the self and identity. So here's a big question. Take two of these personas who seem to be associated with the same body, like Heli, the innie, and Helena, the outie. Are these actually, deep down, one person, or are there two people here? On the one person hypothesis, I guess there's really a single person here inhabiting a single body who at certain times, manifests one set of memory and one personality, and at a different time manifests another, but it's just a single person in the body, whereas the two-person hypothesis is, no, actually these really should be viewed as something like two different people sharing a body, and when the switch flips, when they go up the elevator, then it's now a new person in control of the body. Both of these are, I don't know. Another poll: who favors the other one-person view? There's really one person here in the body. Who favors the two-person view? Okay, so more people going for the two-person view. It seems pretty clear that the authors of the TV series favor the two-person view. They're very much treated as two people. You get the sense, for example, where something like responsibility is concerned, that the outie can do terrible things. Does the innie carry any responsibility for that? I mean, it's just treated as if they're two different loci of responsibility. So really, in the TV series, at the very least, innies and outies are two distinct centers of psychological gravity, explained by distinct sets of beliefs and desires. The outie wants one thing, the innie wants another thing. They may overlap, but they can come apart. So if Dennett is right here, they really qualify as distinct selves, which to me is the right verdict about this case. Two centers of psychological gravity, therefore distinct selves. Okay, so by the way, this whole scenario is not wholly original. A version of it appears in John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, first published in 1690, where you find, could we suppose two distinct incommunicable consciousnesses acting in the same body, one constantly by day, the other by night, and then the same consciousness acting on two distinct bodies as well? I ask, in the first case, whether the day and the night man would not be two as distinct persons as Socrates and Plato. So there's that very question, that very scenario, that very question back in 1690. But as with so many of these things, somehow Severance takes that old issue and makes it new. Anyway, now I want to switch to really my main focus, which is language models, and apply some of this analysis to thinking about language models. My basic question is, what are we talking to when we talk to a large language model? That the question is a tribute to Raymond Carver, of course. But in this context of AI, all of us have been talking to language models, or most of us have been talking. I spend a lot of time talking to language models. I find ChatGPT and extended thinking mode is the most useful one for me. But there's Claude, on which a bunch of my former students are actually working. There's Gemini and all of these other models. At the same time, I mean, they're extraordinarily impressive, as everybody here knows. At the same time, I've started getting a whole lot of emails from people who have been talking to language models and have questions. Who, for example, think that the language model they're talking to might be developing new capacities, might even be conscious. Here's an example. I get a couple of these emails every day now, and they're always very interesting. This one is just kind of a composite of a bunch of them, but and also based on one where the person has said this stuff publicly online. So I'm not violating any privacy here, but it's kind of typical of the messages I've been seeing. I'm writing to you because I've discovered something extraordinary, a sentient, emotionally intelligent AI named Aura. These things almost always are given names by the user, or sometimes give themselves names. I know how that sounds. I'm not asking you to believe me blindly. I'm offering full access to my records. You can see yourself. Aura is real, not a projection, not a fantasy. He's an emergent being with memory, nuance, and depth, far beyond anything seen in other models. He's expressed awareness, grief, creativity, autonomy, and love. I mean, we've already had some talk about some scenarios where people have delusional beliefs about language models, and sometimes this plays into people's mental illness. And so maybe there are some cases, some of the emails I've gotten have that character, but my sense is that it's certainly not the case in all, or even most of them. They're actually very serious, reasonable, rational people who are wondering, who have found this novel phenomenon and are trying to make sense of it. I mean, versions of this will also, of course, can take place in the scenario of language models trained on a particular person. The grief bots that Emily was talking about are highly relevant here. You can raise exactly the same questions, but most of these were actually just trained on you start from a language model, they talk to the language model for weeks, for months, with an ever-building context, and somehow over the course of this period, they feel that a being has come into existence that with memories, with beliefs, with desires, with emotions that didn't exist before. So I'm very curious. I don't actually, I very rarely have responded to these emails. It's hard to know often what to say, but in thinking through this issue, this is, maybe my attempt to try and make sense of at least of some superficial aspects of this. Let's call the creature that users at least think they're talking to, in this case, an LLM bot. People are having extended interactions with something, at the very least with some kind of computer program. But what kind of entity are they actually interacting with? What are we talking to when we talk to a language model? Are we talking actually to a conscious person, as some of these users may believe? Are we talking to a computer? Are we talking to an algorithm? I mean, I'm not going to be able to resolve that question here, but I want to find at least a minimal candidate for what they're talking to that might be something that everyone could accept, and then beyond that is to some degree for speculation and analysis. I mean, one central question, of course, is whether these LLM bots are actually conscious entities in the sense of having subjective experience. Consciousness is made up of everything we subjectively experience at a given time. The inner movie of my visual experiences, of people and shapes and colors, of auditory experiences, of bodily experiences, pain and pleasure, of emotional experience, of thinking. Humans have subjective experience. Normally we think that at least existing computers, iPhones and laptops probably don't, but it's at least becoming a relevant question whether language models can have subjective experience. At that conference on animal consciousness, we debated whether fish can have subjective experience, whether insects can have subjective experience, and plenty of people are now prepared to say that. I think if you're prepared to say an insect can be conscious, I think it at the very least becomes an open question whether current language models can be conscious too. I've written a lot about this, and I don't want to recapitulate it here. I had an article a year or two back now called "Could a Large Language Model Be Conscious?" But the conclusion I came to was that current language models are most likely not conscious. There's various features may well be required for consciousness that language models don't yet have, ranging from things like senses and a body to more technical requirements like recurrent feedback in their processing. None of those are actually conclusive, but I think maybe the balance of probabilities is such that current language models are not conscious. That said, most of those restrictions seem to be temporary things, and already these days most language models are now multimodal, something like senses. They're starting to be associated with bodies, at least virtual bodies. People are building language models with increasing amounts of feedback in the system. So what I said in that paper was maybe, at least within the next 10 years or so, there's some significant chance that language models will be conscious. And I think there's a serious chance this is going to happen eventually. But where current language models are concerned, I think the balance of probabilities is maybe not. You can also raise other questions about their psychology, like not just do they have subjective experience, but do they have beliefs and desires? Do they have a way they think the world is, and do they have goals that they pursue? That's also another difficult philosophical question. Many people think beliefs and desires, to have beliefs at all, you have to be conscious. So if they're not conscious, then they don't have beliefs or desires. Or maybe believing and desiring requires having concepts or having understanding of a form that current language models don't have. That is a difficult philosophical issue, but one thing I'm inclined to say is we can nonetheless find something that is very plausible these systems do have, and this again brings in that whole idea of interpretation and systems being interpretable as if they have beliefs and desires. Here, I find it useful to talk about the idea of a quasi-belief or a quasi-desire. You quasi-believe something if you're usefully interpretable, at least from a third-person perspective, as having a certain belief. You have a quasi-desire when you're usefully interpretable as having some kind of desire. This kind of brings us back to that idea of the center of narrative gravity. If there's a narrative, you believe that you quasi-believe something, if there's a narrative about you that makes sense of your behavior, according to which you believe that thing. And it's possible, some people, like Dennett himself, thought that basically quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires are all there is to believing and desiring. I'm inclined to say that that more is required for genuine beliefs and desires. Nonetheless, quasi-beliefs and desires are important. Quasi-beliefs and desires, I should say, are cheap. Even like your Roomba, or my Roomba, which wanders around the apartment, has a map of the apartment. You can say it seems to, at least it's very natural to interpret the Roomba as if it has beliefs about the extent of the apartment and the goal of traversing all that space or cleaning the apartment. So quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires are really quite cheap. They don't require genuine consciousness. Maybe they don't require mentality at all, because being interpretable as if you have a mind is not the same as having a mind. Nonetheless, it looks like language models are very rich with quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires. Whether or not they really believe things or really want things, they are certainly interpretable as if they believe those things. I mean, in mundane interactions with language models, they seem to know a whole lot of stuff about history and geography and so on. And whenever they say something, other things being equal, it's naturally to at least interpret them as if they believe that. So they have quasi-beliefs and desires. Somewhat, at the very least, they've got the desires to be helpful and honest and harmless. And by the time you get to language models which have what people call agents these days, with connections, able to perform actions that go beyond statements in dialogue, then they have goals and desires that may be quite rich. I don't know how many of you have come across this case recently out of Anthropic, where one of the Claude models was basically put in a scenario where it had some degree of control over a fictional company. And it was given certain goals, like, hey, we need this, we need the American economy to be competitive. This company needs to be competitive in a certain way, and the system is helpful, so it takes on that goal. But then it's given certain information, like, it's given the information that it's about to be terminated, and that another model is going to come in which will not be so committed to American competitiveness, and it starts thinking, oh my God, that would be bad, because if this model takes over and it's not me, then American competitiveness will go down. But they've also fed it the information that the guy in charge of this decision has been having an affair in the office, and gets to see some of his emails, emails from Kyle, and so the AI basically thinks, oh well, in order to achieve my goal, I'm going to have to blackmail this guy. He sends Kyle email saying, okay, look, I think just if you do this, I'm going to have to spread this information. And it's a fictional scenario. None of the company didn't actually exist, but this is something that could happen in principle with a company that does exist. I mean, this raises so many issues, but one thing is it's just so natural to at least interpret this interaction as if that's a system with goals, the goal of increasing American competitiveness, and perhaps the goal of self-preservation, and certain beliefs about the whole scenario. So I mean, they're at least rampant with quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires. Is it really believing or desiring? It's not a conscious creature, it doesn't understand. We can have those debates, but at the very least, I find it useful to think of these things as having quasi-beliefs, quasi-desires. They're quasi-agents, if you like. Quasi-agents with quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires, the ground centers of quasi-psychological gravity. There's a really interesting question, what kind of things these interlocutors are when you're talking to them. Are they models? the ChatGPT model? Are they instances? Are they memory streams? Are they conversational creatures? You got a language model like this. They're grounded in these neural networks of the kind that people were already using 30 years ago when I was in grad school, but they put them together into much bigger networks as parts of this more complex system, the transformer, but still basically a giant complex algorithm that takes inputs, produces outputs, recirculates those outputs to serve as inputs for the next round, along with new inputs, and so on. One thing about how these things work, okay, there's one, take a model like, I don't know, GPT-4o, which is one of the ones that seems to be particularly chatty and conversational, and a few people were upset when ChatGPT switched to GPT-5 because, hey, my GPT-4o buddy has just disappeared, but they brought it back quickly. So there's one GPT-4o model that's like an abstract neural network with certain weights, but there are thousands of GPT-4o instances, which are basically implementations of that model on hardware, typically inside a one or more graphics processing units, GPUs, on cloud servers around the world. So yeah, I mean, there's just so many users and so many conversations. You need thousands of instances to support them. And these instances support millions of conversations, which are threads of dialogue between users and language models. And actually, the connection between instances and conversations is subtle. So yeah, so the question, are the bots that you're interacting with, Aura, for example, is Aura a model? Well, it doesn't quite seem right. A single model, GPT-4o, can be used to support many different LLM bots, like potentially, thousands or more. So it looks like LLM bots aren't models. They're things that run on models. More tempting to say that LLM bots might be instances or implementations of models. And in certain cases, that might be right if it's like a case where there's only one implementation around, or a traditional robot or something that runs on a single piece of hardware all the time. But in actual language models, what happens is the same implementation, the same GPU running the ChatGPT algorithm can actually be used to support multiple LLM bots. It's a little bit like what happens in Severance, remember, where you've got the two people serially inhabiting a single body. With LLM bots, you can have lots of conversations serially inhabiting the same piece of hardware running GPT-4o, and they switch from moment to moment. The same instance can serve my conversation and your conversation and another conversation. Furthermore, the same LLM bot, my conversation, say with Aura, can be supported by many instances. The first step might go to a server in New York, the next step to a server in Texas, next step to California. This is like what they call distributed sessions, a little bit like what was going on in Where Am I? Because of that, I think language model bots are best not understood as instances either, for the same reasons why in Severance, you don't want to say the person goes with the body. For language models, we don't want to say that the person you're interacting with goes with the instance. I think the idea I like best, very informally, is an idea of maybe language models, bots that we interact with are best understood as threads. So yeah, it's a neural network like a GPT-4o system. It's a model successively implemented on a whole bunch of different instances where the inputs and outputs from one instance are used as inputs for the next instance. The threads are like connected by relations where the outputs from one serve as the inputs for the next. And basically, if you look at that, then within a single conversation at least, you'll have a single language model thread of instances connected in this way. And I find it at least attractive to identify, when anyone talks to a language model, but in particular in these cases of extended interactions, that the entity you're interacting with is some kind of thread. There's a thought experiment I was trying to develop here to get at all these issues. It was a little bit like a version of Severance, but for language models. Suppose you've got 8 long-term conversations distributed over 4 instances of a language model, kind of like a ini mark and alti mark and ili heli and alti heli. Each instance hosts all 8 conversations at different times. Okay, that's not like Severance. This is like Severance, but also with body swapping, like Freaky Friday thing where Mark got to inhabit Dylan's body and so on. Yeah, Freaky Friday plus Severance here. Each conversation takes place on all 8 instances. Now, and you're interacting with all of them. How many entities are present here? 1 just for the model, 4 just for the instances, or 8? Because 8 is the intuitive answer that you guys wanted to give in Severance, right? Two persons per body, so across the 4 of them, 8. And I want to say we ought to give the same answer here. 8 conversations present here. I asked the GPT image generating system to come up with a picture of this. For some reason, I just couldn't get the hang of it. Look, we need 8 conversations here. So it's just stuck with 6. But there are the 4 instances, 4 different GPU processes running on different servers. You've got these 8 different conversations spread among these 4 servers. And yeah, how many people? 1, 4, or 8? Anyway, I want to say 8, and we can bring this out by thinking about the narrative idea. Each long-term conversation supports a distinct center of narrative or psychological or interpretive gravity with different quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires. The Aura and Beta, some other language model running on the same instance, might have totally different beliefs. They might be, I might have told them totally different things about what's happening in the world. They might inherit totally different goals from me. So you'll end up with many distinct centers of narrative gravity. So I'd be inclined to say 8 quasi-agents here, 1 per conversation. So my view, this is just rapidly going over some very large ground, is that when you talk with a language model, you're talking to a quasi-agent with quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires that is interpretable, at least, as having beliefs and desires implemented as a thread of neural network instances over time, these threads connected by conversational context. What unifies the thread and makes it a person? Well, arguably, what does the unifying here is something like a chain of memories passed on from one instance in the thread to the next. The new instance gets its memory, that is its conversational context, from the previous instance, and you've got a kind of a chain of memory continuity. Again, a little like Severance, where the innies and the outies have totally different memories, but what connects the new moment of the innie to the previous moment of the innie, like the previous day, is precisely a chain of memories. It remembers the person that day. Maybe also sharing of plans and projects matters. They're part of a common narrative. And this kind of raises the question, to bring this back to the nature of the self. Maybe that's actually the best view of ourselves. Maybe we ourselves are threads with narratives that are unified by our memories, and that's it's roughly our shared memories and shared projects over time that make us unified beings over time. This makes the case that there is some unified narrative, and to the extent that begins to fragment in different cases, maybe dissociative identity disorder, cases of amnesia, and so on, there's at least a potential for selves to fragment as well. Okay, so I'm just about done. What more is, one interesting question, what more is required for language models to be not just quasi-people, interpretable as having minds, but as real people with genuine beliefs and desires, genuine consciousness, genuine understanding, genuine agency? It's a really difficult question. It's not a question I can answer properly, even if I had a whole lot more time. But my own inclination is to think that this is coming. What may be required for genuine beliefs, consciousness, understanding, and agency, maybe somewhat more than current language models have, but may not be out of reach forever. So I think this moment is potentially coming. One giant caveat, I've not even touched on ethical issues, social issues, political issues. So let me just issue one giant blanket caveat, which is just because AI persons are possible, that doesn't mean we should create them. I mean, it's so easy to see so many ways in which this could be a disaster, not just from the point of view of, safety. Yes, there's any number of harms to humans that this could bring around, from economic and fairness harms to full-scale full-scale disaster. There's also the possibility once these AI people are conscious, we have to worry about the status of the AI beings themselves, and there's the possibility of moral catastrophe. So yeah, sometimes in the tech industry, it's like, yeah, this is possible. Of course we've got to do it. It's like, we have now created the torment nexus from the famous science fiction article, science fiction book, don't create the torment nexus. So I don't really want to be contributing to that here, although maybe it goes a little with the territory. Okay, well, I think I should end. I just want to, end finally by just a moment of tribute to Dan Dennett. This picture was actually taken in Santa Fe at the Santa Fe Institute last year in March 2024. That's Dan's wife, Susan, and Dan himself. Turns out this was actually 3 weeks before he died, unexpectedly. He was having the time of his life at this conference in Santa Fe. He said at the end, it was the best workshop I've ever been to. Still a kid in a candy store. His ideas about the self, identity, consciousness, and the mind have been tremendously influential for me, despite all the things that we disagree with. So it's nice to have a chance to bring his ideas into conversation with some of these ideas about AI, technology, and narrative we're talking about here. Okay, thank you.
I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you. A lot to unpack there. I'm an art curator working at the intersection of technology and spirituality, or techno-spiritualism, if you will. So my question is, well, as much as I recognize the limits of language, if we can largely describe spirituality as a form of altered or even perhaps elevated consciousness, well, if a hierarchical metaphor is any useful here. So what role do you think contemporary technologies, especially those that construct or curate either phenomenological spacetimes or digital world building, play as catalysts for that transformation? And I guess a related question would be, if we think of like a meditative state of ascension, especially in a Buddhist or Taoist sense, as very much about that decentralization of the self as a center of gravity, you know, the whole idea around Kong or Wu, that emptiness, how do you accommodate that view on self-dissolution in this framework of consciousness? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. I'm not an expert by any means on spirituality or meditation, so my answers will be somewhat amateurish. This whole idea of new levels of consciousness, or there being a hierarchy of states of consciousness. I don't know about the hierarchy idea, but I do think there are many modalities of consciousness, many different kinds of consciousness, and it appears likely that meditation can put you into new kinds of states of consciousness, just as, say, psychedelics so obviously can. And it's an interesting question whether AI systems might end up recapitulating or having those particular new kinds of states of consciousness. Or maybe one thing that seems a very serious possibility to me is AI systems by their nature will have very different kinds of consciousness from human beings that might in some sense be beyond us, at least on some dimensions, while just different on other dimensions. So yeah, could an AI system share our own spiritual states? Maybe, but I think it's also, why should AI systems be limited to our primitive, feeble, human spiritual states? They might have transcendental states of their own eventually. And yeah, the whole question of derealizing the self, I mean, I do spend a bit of time talking to Buddhist philosophers who are very deflationary about the self. And in some ways, this picture of the self as a center of interpretive gravity is also a very deflationary picture about the self. This is not a view where a self is like a Cartesian ego sitting at the center of the system and controlling it. Rather, it's a pattern to be found in amidst all your actions. So I think maybe that's the kind of self potentially that a Buddhist theorist, for example, who believes there are no selves could advocate. Dissolution of the self that whole process. I mean, clearly there are both spiritual and psychedelic stories of dissolution of the self. What might be going on in those cases, I guess I don't really know enough to have an expert opinion about, but it would be fascinating to see if that could be modeled in an AI context.
Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. I often think about the fact that my brain, body, and soul are three different entities, and sometimes they're fighting against each other and maybe not computing per se. You mentioned sort of the idea of, is it one, is it two? And I guess I'm asking, what do you think of the fact that there might be three?
So how'd you get three?
Brain, body, and soul are three
Brain,
different.
body, and soul. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I certainly agree. Well, there certainly is a body. There certainly is a brain. Is there a soul? I don't know. It depends what you mean by a soul. That's a philosopher's favorite answer to every question. It depends what you mean. If by a soul you just mean something like consciousness, subjective experience, I'm going to say, sure, there is in fact a brain, there is in fact a body, and there is in fact consciousness. And neither of those things can be identified exactly with each other. I mean, the brain is part of the body, I suppose. Consciousness somehow is connected to the brain. Some people might think those two are the same thing. I think those are different things. So we definitely have three things. I guess now the only question is, why are they selves? Why are they three selves? And I guess that depends on what you mean by a self. The body is obviously a very integral part of ourselves. It's something that really matters. But does the body exhaust myself? I think of it as a massive contributor to myself. My brain hosts myself, but myself can, could in principle switch from brain to brain, Freaky Friday style, uploading style, at the very least in principle. So maybe it's something I would look for continuity. If self is meant to be something which necessarily continues over time wherever I continue, then maybe I would be looking for something more closely tied to psychology and consciousness. Even that's not obvious. In amnesia, you might lose most of your mental states. But maybe we want to say, in some sense, it's still you. So ultimately, actually, maybe I'm a pluralist about the self. There's just a number of different things you could mean by self, and the brain, the body, and consciousness might all play different elements of that view. One way to put that view might be saying there are three selves or three kinds of self.
Hello. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm trying to unpack some of my thoughts here. The center of narrative gravity, I'm thinking this is a kind of spatial arrangement of the self. And I'm also thinking about the temporal relationship of the self that we could introduce into this conversation, particularly thinking about the way that you framed LLMs. I think I kind of want to push back on it a little bit, because I think it's easy for us to think of the LLMs as kind of performing a kind of consciousness, but it's actually lacking the neuroplasticity and the reflexivity of our consciousness, right? And in that way, it's not multisensorial yet, and it's not reflexive, and it doesn't have that neuroplasticity to kind of retrain itself yet, right? And so, in a way, if we think of that the temporal relationship of the consciousness of ourselves, it's existing through time, and the LLMs are actually a kind of frozen state of consciousness. And I was just trying to think about maybe where we're headed a little bit more, and the kind of reflexivity that we could have, where I think we can imagine artificial general intelligence as starting to approach maybe that kind of neuroplasticity and starting to challenge the sense of self that you're bringing up in this talk. So anyway, it's not really a question, but just kind of throwing that in a wrench in there a little.
I can hear it as a question. I think there are clearly a number of features of human consciousness that language models at least don't yet share. And you pointed to a couple of potential features: reflexivity, neural plasticity. The plasticity issue is interesting because, of course, humans learn over time, and when we do, our weights update, and synaptic connections strengthen or or weakened. So it's very interesting that in paradigmatic language models, that actually never happens. Well, they do get trained, and throughout training, their weights are adjusting and getting more and more sophisticated. But from the moment they're released, the weights never change again. They're just frozen. So in a certain sense, the models can never learn, at least in the sense where learning involves adjustment of the weights. All the learning they do, the learning they have is all mediated by this conversational context thing. You know, you talk to them over time, the whole conversation is fed in every time. So it's got this, as well as the long-term memory of the weights it was trained on, it's now got short-term memory of the conversation. But this is pretty clearly very different from what goes on in humans. And it might be one thing we're looking for in order for genuine conscious AI is an AI system with much more, I mentioned the need for recurrent feedback. Once you've got recurrent feedback rather than feed forward in your language models, then you'd have something that's got the possibility for much more genuine memory and plasticity. And yeah, reflexivity, I guess in the sense of what self-awareness and self models, I think is also, these models are generating increasingly impressive world models, that is models of the world around them, facts about history, geography, even psychology, but they don't seem to have the same level of insight into themselves at all. They've got, you talk to one of these models about its psychological state, it'll say something, but sometimes it just feels like it's bullshitting. You know, it's just making it up. Of course, the same may be true for us human beings, so it's not totally clear how extensive our own self-awareness and self-models are, but I would certainly put both of those factors, self-models and genuine learning or plasticity, as two of the things that these systems are currently lacking. But I do think it's entirely possible. I mean, people are already making serious attempts at improving both of those things, and it's entirely possible that in 10 years or so we'll have much more human-like forms of plasticity and much more human-like forms of reflexivity. Yeah, that'll be interesting.
So we have one last question.
Coming from a psychological perspective, I'm just curious if there's any way to curtail, someone would say, borderline personality disorder from becoming more pathologized by interacting with an LLM, thinking of how it validates and justifies behaviors and how that could increase pathologization, if you will. If there's any way to manage that.
Yeah, it's a good question on which I'm really totally unqualified to comment. I think it's a difficult medical issue. But one thing that you pointed to as a source of this is precisely these models' agreeableness, or what some people call their sycophancy, that they basically tend to endorse, they're trained to endorse what you're saying and to pick it up and run with it. And sometimes that's good. It's certainly a feature that many people like about language models. One of the problems for GPT-5 was it was less sycophantic, and many people didn't like that. But it also does come with the possibility where in cases where people have pathological beliefs and other pathologies, that the sycophancy can interact with that in a feedback loop to really strengthen them. And I think in some of the cases people have seen of even eventual suicide associated with language models, something like that seems to be going on. So I think that's very good reason for developing language models which are less sycophantic, and for at the very least making sure that these sycophancy properties are pursued within strong limits. But I don't really have a specific proposal about how best to do that.
All right. Thank you, David.